Across medieval France, a network of hospitals bore a name that should stop you cold. They were called Hôpitaux des Démembrés, which translates to Hospitals of the Dismembered. And if you approached one, you would know exactly why. Because hanging above the entrance, strung up like grotesque wind chimes, were the amputated limbs of the people inside. Blackened fingers, rotting feet, entire arms, severed and displayed as offerings to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of those afflicted by a disease so common in the Middle Ages that it earned its own saintly name. Saint Anthony's fire. The cause of this disease was not war, not plague, not punishment from God. It was bread. Ordinary rye bread, consumed at an ordinary meal, in an ordinary alehouse, on an ordinary Tuesday. A fungus called ergot infected the grain, and when that grain was ground into flour and baked, anyone who ate it risked convulsions, gangrene, hallucinations, and the slow, excruciating death of their own extremities. By the end of the 15th century, monks treating this condition had built roughly 370 hospitals across Europe. One single outbreak in France in 994 killed between 20,000 and 40,000 people. And nobody understood why it was happening. For centuries, nobody even came close. That bread, by the way, was considered one of the safer things you could eat at an English alehouse. Welcome to the 12th century. You have just walked through the door of a public house in medieval England. A low-ceilinged, smoke-filled room inside someone's actual home, where the woman of the house brews ale in the same space where her family sleeps and eats and keeps livestock. The floor beneath your feet is packed earth. The air smells of sweat, animal dung, fermentation, and wood smoke, all competing for dominance in a space roughly 250 to 300 square feet. That is smaller than a modern studio apartment, and it is shared by a family, their animals, and now you, along with however many neighbors, have wandered in to drink. Outside, the streets are open sewers. Dung, garbage, and animal carcasses rot in rivers and ditches. Archaeological digs from places like York have confirmed that Anglo-Saxon people dug their wells and their cesspits within feet of each other, which tells you everything you need to know about the general relationship between medieval England and the concept of contamination. Life expectancy at birth for boys from land-owning families, plus the wealthy ones, sat at 31.3 years. If you were a destitute cottager, your average lifespan dropped to around 30. And the food and drink available at the local alehouse was not designed to help you beat those odds. It was designed to keep you alive until tomorrow. Sometimes it failed at that, too. To understand why an English alehouse could kill you, you first need to understand what ale actually meant to the people of this era, because it was not a recreational beverage. It was survival. Grains dominated the medieval English diet to a degree that is almost difficult to comprehend today. Scholars estimate that agricultural workers drew around 80% of their total calorie intake from grain. Soldiers came in at roughly 75%. Even the nobility, with their access to meat and imported luxuries, still received about 65% of their calories from grain-based foods. And those grain calories arrived in three main forms: bread, pottage, and ale. Ale was not a drink you reached for at the end of a long day. It was one of three pillars holding up the entire nutritional architecture of English life. People called it liquid bread, and they were not exaggerating. Every person in medieval England drank ale every single day. Men, women, children, monks, soldiers, peasants, nobles. The standard consumption rate sat at roughly 1 gallon per person per day. Monks at Westminster Abbey each received their gallon. In 1272, a husband and wife who retired at Selby Abbey were allotted 2 gallons daily, alongside 2 loaves of white bread and 1 loaf of brown. And the household of Henry de Lacy purchased an average of 85 gallons of ale per day in 1299. Framlingham Castle consumed 78 gallons daily in 1385. The monastery of St. Gall at one point allocated each monk 5 quarts of beer every single day. These are not outliers. These are standard operating procedure for keeping people fed and functional in medieval England. The ale itself bore almost no resemblance to what you would recognize as beer today. Medieval ale contained no hops. It was brewed from grain, water, and yeast, bittered with a mixture of herbs and spices called groot, and it came out thick, sweet, and cloudy. Most of the daily drinking ale hovered below 3% alcohol by volume, with the alcohol serving primarily as a preservative rather than an intoxicant. Without hops, which would not arrive in England from the continent until the late 15th century, ale spoiled within hills. One Saxon writer captured the problem with painful clarity, noting that after 2 days, only the bravest or silliest men of the village would drink the ale. But usually it was only fit for pigs. Stale ale was, in fact, frequently fed to actual pigs, which reportedly improved the flavor of the pork. This practice also gave rise to the phrase, "as drunk as swine," which is both the origin of the saying and a fairly accurate description of anyone who drank ale on its 3rd day. And here is where cost enters the picture. In 1310, an unskilled labourer earned at most 1.5 pence per day. A gallon of ale cost roughly a day's wages, but the combination of modern farming and production techniques and increased wages makes grain in the 20th century United States roughly 1/10 as expensive as it was in 13th century England. So when you sat down in that alehouse and called for your gallon, you were not casually ordering a round. You were spending the equivalent of everything you had earned that day on the single most important source of nutrition available to you. If that ale was bad, you did not just lose your money, you lost your meal. The person who brewed that ale, the person your survival literally depended on, was almost certainly a woman. The immense demand for ale across England was satisfied by thousands of brewers, and the majority of them were female. Brewing was one of the few trades genuinely open to medieval women. The mistress of this house brewed ale for her family as a matter of routine, and to earn extra money, many women sold the excess from their homes. These women were called alewives, or brewsters, and to signal that a fresh batch was ready, they would hang a sign outside the entrance. Since most of the population could not read, these signs took the form of objects: brooms, shovels, untold, carved wooden animals, anything visible enough to tell passers-by that ale was available. An alehouse might not even occupy a permanent location. In many villages, people simply drank at the home of whichever neighbor had most recently finished a brew. Some of these women built real careers. Maud London was a prominent brewer living in Oxford during the 14th century, and like many of the most successful names in the industry, she was unmarried. Aleonora Rooming operated out of the Running Horse in Leatherhead, Surrey, and became famous enough to inspire the poet John Skelton's satirical poem, The Tunning of Eleanor Rumming. Aleonora was fined 2 shillings in 1525 for selling ale that was too expensive in measures that were too small, a fine that amounted to less than the cost of a gallon of her own product, which gives you a sense of how seriously the authorities took enforcement and how little it actually deterred anyone. Some historians have noticed an uncomfortable overlap between the way alewives were depicted and the way witches came to be portrayed in later centuries. The bubbling cauldrons, the black cats, the pointed hats, the broomsticks hanging outside the door, As all of these images associated with witchcraft appear to trace directly back to the tools and trappings of medieval alewives. Whether this connection is causal or coincidental remains debated, but the pattern is difficult to ignore. The women who fed England were, in many cases, the same women later demonized by it. And in 1540, the city of Chester made the connection between women and ale explicit in a different way, decreeing that women between the ages of 14 and 40 were banned from selling ale entirely, driven by a widespread fear that young female ale sellers would use their sexual desirability to spread immorality. The trade that had sustained women for centuries was being stripped from them, one city ordinance at a time. But the identity of your brewer mattered far less than what she put in your cup. And what she put in your cup should concern you deeply. Before hops arrived in England, ale was bittered and flavored with groot, a blend of herbs boiled into the wort before fermentation. The traditional groot mixture employed 3 main herbs: bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary. Author Stephen Harrod Buhner described the effects of groot ale in terms that would make a modern food safety inspector resign on the spot. He wrote that groot ale is highly intoxicating, narcotic, aphrodisiacal, and psychotropic when consumed in sufficient quantities. Unlike hops, which are a sedative and tend to make you sleepy, many groot herbs were stimulants. They did not calm you down. They wound you up. This is the origin of the legendary bawdy reputation of medieval alehouses, rooms full of people drinking a mildly psychoactive beverage in a space smaller than your living room. Yarrow, one of the 3 core gruit ingredients, carried a reputation in Scandinavia for making ale dangerously potent, possibly because it contains thujone, the same narcotic compound found in wormwood. Too much yarrow reportedly caused dizziness, ringing in the ears, and according to some accounts, outright madness. Viking warriors, according to certain authorities, consumed large quantities of bog myrtle, specifically to trigger hallucinations and drive themselves into a berserker frenzy before battle. These were the herbs going into your after-work drink. And then there was henbane. Black henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, is a member of the nightshade family. It is genuinely toxic, and it was intentionally added to ale across medieval Europe to increase the sensation of intoxication. In 2011, archaeologists discovered the remnants of a Celtic beer recipe, over 2,550 years old, at a Neolithic brewery site in modern Germany, and it called for henbane. Demand for the plant grew so high that entire gardens were planted to harvest it. These Bilsenkraut gardens became so well known that they served as the namesake for several towns, including the Czech town of Pilsen, the birthplace of the Pilsner. And it has been speculated that the original Pilsners contained doses of bitter-tasting henbane before hops replaced it. In relatively low doses, henbane induced mild psychoactive effects that made beer feel stronger than it actually was. Historically, a henbane was used in combination with other plants like mandrake, deadly nightshade, and datura as both an anesthetic and a component in what were called magic brews, preparations known for inducing visual hallucinations and a sensation of flight. The German Brewers Association has acknowledged that prior to modern regulations, dubious ingredients were regularly mixed into beer, including henbane, thorn apple, wood shavings, roots, soot, and even pitch, and that if a brewer miscalculated with some of these ingredients, at the very least a guest might be overcome by malaise, and at worst, the sip of beer would become his last. Here is the detail that should make you stare at the wall for a moment. Black henbane has the side effect of causing dry mouth, which means your first impulse after drinking a henbane-laced ale was to immediately drink another one. Medieval brewers had accidentally, or perhaps not so accidentally, invented the world's first self-reinforcing sales mechanism, centuries before anyone had a word for marketing. It was not until 1516 that Bavaria's purity law finally outlawed ingredients other than barley, hops, yeast, and water. Until then, you simply drank whatever was in the cup and hoped the brewer had not miscalculated. Now, everything I have described so far concerns only the drink. We have not even discussed the food. And trust me, the food deserves its own category of concern, because what sat on the table in front of you at a medieval alehouse carried risks that went far beyond bad taste. The plate you ate from was not a plate. It was a trencher, and a flat round of stale bread cut into a large rectangle and used as a surface to hold your food. You ate the meal off the bread, and at the end, you could eat the trencher itself, soaked through with whatever juices and sauces had accumulated on it, or you could hand it off as alms to the poor. Your food arrived in shared serving dishes, placed in the center of the table, and you ate what was closest to you by reaching in with your hands, or occasionally with a serving fork or spoon. Your drinking vessel was almost certainly a jack, a mug made of leather, waterproofed with pitch or beeswax. On the continent, leather drinking vessels were considered barbaric, and there is no polite way to say this, but the continent was right. The food itself centered on pottage, a thick stew made from grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat. Pottage was the foundation of the medieval English diet, alongside bread and ale, and it had one quality that was both its greatest strength and its most unsettling feature. A pot of pottage could sit over the fire for days. You would eat some, add more ingredients, eat some more, add more ingredients, and the dish would change composition constantly, without ever being fully emptied or cleaned. What you ate on Thursday was not what someone else ate on Monday, but it all came from the same pot, which had been simmering continuously for longer than you would want to think about. The grains available to you depended entirely on your social class. Barley, oats, and rye were the grains of the poor. Wheat was expensive and largely reserved for those who could afford it. The most common meats were pork, chicken, and other poultry, since beef required greater investment in land and appeared less frequently at ordinary tables. And meat of any kind vanished from your diet 3 days a week, on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, because religious fasting laws prohibited it. Bread was the single most important food in medieval England. Its significance ran so deep that it shaped the language itself. The word lord descends from the Anglo-Saxon hlafward, meaning loaf guardian, and the word lady comes from hlefdaiga, meaning loaf maker. A lifetime of eating cheaper bread, ground on stone mills, wore people's teeth down to nubs, because grit from the grinding stones embedded itself in the flour and could never be fully removed. You were eating stone with every bite, slowly sanding your own teeth into stumps. Isotope and bone analysis from 14th and 15th century skeletons unearthed at Charterhouse Square revealed widespread signs of malnutrition, and 1 in 6 of those individuals suffered from rickets. These were city dwellers, people with access to markets and commerce. The countryside fared no better, and often fared worse. And the bread could betray you in ways far more sudden than malnutrition. In 14th century London, bakers were caught selling bread mixed with dirt or chalk, or with iron bars inserted into the loaves to make them weigh more at market. A baker named William Chester was dragged from the Guildhall through Cheapside to Temple Bar for cheating his customers. Another baker, Richard Hayne, who had adulterated his bread with sand, was transported to Newgate Prison on a hurdle, with his tainted bread carried before him on a lance, a public procession designed to humiliate him as thoroughly as possible. The Assize of Bread and Ale, enacted around 1266 under King Henry III, was the first law in British history to regulate the production and sale of food, and its enforcement was not gentle. The concept of the baker's dozen, providing 13 units instead of 12, originates from this era, as bakers added an extra loaf to every sale to protect themselves from accusations of short weight under the Assize's unforgiving inspection regime. But no amount of regulation could protect you from ergot. The fungus Claviceps purpurea grows on rye, and when infected grain was harvested, ground and baked into bread, everyone who ate it became a victim. The affliction known as St. Anthony's fire produced two distinct forms. One attacked the nervous system, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and spasms. The other, the gangrenous form, slowly killed the blood supply to the extremities, turning fingers, toes, hands, and feet black before they fell away entirely. The earliest reference to ergotism appears in the Annales Xantensis for the year 857, which describes a great plague of swollen blisters that consumed the people by a loathsome rot, so that their limbs were loosened and fell off before death. Survivors, the rare ones, were usually left severely deformed by the loss of whatever limbs the disease had claimed. The scale of suffering is staggering. Waves of outbreaks sickened millions and killed tens of thousands across the medieval period. In the 11th century, a young French nobleman named Guérin la Valois survived the disease and credited the relics of St. Anthony with his recovery. He and his father founded what would become the monastic order of the Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony around 1095, an organization dedicated entirely to treating victims. By the end of the 15th century, the order had built roughly 370 hospitals across Europe, in France, Flanders, Germany, Spain, and Italy. Sufferers flocked to these monasteries, which were identified by the gangrenous limbs hanging above their entrances like the world's most horrifying welcome sign. The ergo fungus, incidentally, is the natural source of lysergic acid, the chemical precursor to LSD. When medieval chroniclers described victims of St. Anthony's fire experiencing vivid hallucinations, no, they were not speaking metaphorically. These people were, in a very literal biochemical sense, tripping. According to Snorri Sturluson in the Heimskringla, King Magnus II of Norway died from ergotism shortly after the Battle of Hastings, which means a king was killed by bread. Nobody understood the connection between infected rye and the disease until a French physician identified it in 1670, and it was not formally confirmed until 1676. For over 800 years, people ate bread, lost their limbs, and had no idea why. Medieval people were quicker to suspect that an enemy had laced their food with hemlock or wolfsbane, or even the so-called composition of death, a mix of red copper, nitric acid, verdigris, arsenic, oak bark, rose water, and black soot, than to imagine that a cook's unwashed hands or a contaminated grain supply could be responsible. The authorities did try to impose order on this chaos, with mixed results at best. Alehouse were officers appointed yearly to ensure the quality of bread, ale, and beer, to regulate the measures in which they were sold, and to monitor their prices. A royal manor granted to Merton Priory in 1121 already had its own ale taster on the rolls. The famous legend that Alehouse tested beer by sitting in puddles of it while wearing leather breeches, waiting to see if the liquid stuck to the leather, has no known contemporary evidence behind it. The actual oaths these men swore required only that they be prepared to taste ale when it went on sale. And tasting was dangerous work. Without hops or safe brewing methods, the ale that had turned could make a person seriously ill. Many ale-conners got sick from bad batches, and some of them died. In the late autumn of 1310, A jury gathered in Oxford to review grain prices and set ale prices accordingly, a formal proceeding that reveals how seriously the government took the relationship between the cost of raw ingredients and the price of the finished drink. Judith Bennett, whose 1996 book on women and brewing remains the foundational scholarly work on the subject, examined London Brewers Guild reports and concluded that these wealthy and prestigious guildsmen regularly cheated their measures, sold unwholesome ale or beer, charged unfair prices, brewed strong beer that encouraged drunkenness, tolerated disorderly houses, kept unclean premises, and wantonly disobeyed city orders. And these were the established, or regulated, guild-affiliated brewers. The situation in rural alehouses, where oversight was minimal and alewives used whatever cups they had available, was considerably worse. Punishments for those who were caught ranged from fines to public humiliation to genuine physical danger. A 14th century Scottish law collection, the Regiam Majestatem, specified that anyone who makes evil ale, contrary to the use and health of the burgh, shall pay 8 shillings, or shall suffer the justice of the burgh, that is, she shall be put upon the cuck stool. The cucking stool, a device first recorded in the Domesday Book, was used specifically in Chester to punish people who sold bad ale or incorrect measures. This evolved into the ducking stool, which appeared in England during the 12th century and remained in use until the early 19th century. But one of the last recorded victims was Elizabeth Caledon of Leominster, subjected to the punishment in 1809 before a large crowd after being accused of being a common scold. Ducking stool punishment could result in death. The line between regulation and execution was, at times, uncomfortably thin. In 1547, the town council of Elgin received complaints that the ale tasters had become so enthusiastic in their sampling duties that they had, in the words of the complaint, lost the very taste of their mouths and could no longer render accurate judgments. The people tasked with protecting you from bad ale had drunk themselves into incompetence. 4 ale conners are still appointed annually by the Common Hall of the City of London, a role that is now entirely ceremonial and always performed with considerable humour. In 2007, Dr. Sir Christine Rigdon became the first woman appointed to the position in the role's 700-year history. They still wear the leather breeches. Drunkenness itself was not even a civil offence in England until the Alehouses Act of 1551, which means that for the vast majority of the medieval period, there was literally no law against being drunk. By 1577, England had one alehouse for every 142 inhabitants. By the 1630s, that number had swollen to 50,000 alehouses, or 1 for every 95 people. The alehouse was where you ate, drank, socialized, made oaths, and settled disputes. An oath made under alehouse testimony, a declaration spoken publicly beneath its roof, was as legally binding as one made in a court of law. You could transfer property, settle debts, or even dispose of a spouse through alehouse testimony. The Church viewed these establishments as direct competition for the hearts, minds, and coins of the faithful, and laws were enacted to make non-church religious events held at alehouses illegal. The alehouse was not just where you went to drink. It was a parallel institution, a shadow court, a substitute church, and the social heart of English life for centuries. And it could kill you at any time, through any number of mechanisms that nobody fully understood. So here is what it would have actually meant for your life if you had been born into 12th century England and walked into an alehouse looking for a meal and a drink. You would have sat in a space smaller than a parking spot, sharing air with livestock and strangers, eating off a slab of stale bread, whilst reaching into communal dishes with your bare hands. Your drink, which you needed as desperately as the food itself, was a sweet, cloudy, rapidly spoiling liquid that may have been laced with henbane, yarrow, bog myrtle, or any number of psychoactive herbs that could leave you hallucinating, nauseous, or worse. The bread on the table could contain chalk, dirt, ground stone, or invisible ergot fungus capable of rotting your fingers off over the course of weeks. The pottage had been simmering for days, absorbing whatever went into it without discrimination. Your leather cup smelled of pitch. Your teeth were already half ground away, and you would have paid an entire day's wages for the privilege. You consumed a gallon of this every single day, because the alternative was starvation. But the people who brewed it were women working out of their own homes, doing their best with no training, no regulation for most of the period, and no understanding of microbiology. The people who inspected it sometimes died from the inspection. The people who cheated you were rarely caught, and when they were, the fines amounted to less than the cost of the product they had adulterated. The fungus in your bread would not be identified for 800 years. The hallucinogenic herbs in your ale would not be banned for 4 centuries. The connection between contaminated water and disease would not be understood for longer still. Every meal was an act of faith. Every cup was a roll of the dice. And if you made it to 50, you had beaten odds that most of your neighbors never came close to. The medieval alehouse gave England its language, and its social fabric, its legal customs and its daily bread, all served in a room that smelled like a barn and tasted like a gamble. You drank because you had to. You ate because there was nothing else. And you survived, if you survived at all, not because the system worked, but because your body absorbed just enough punishment to keep going for one more day. The 12th century did not care whether you enjoyed the experience. It only asked whether you could endure it.